The midday sun beat down on the Naval Special Warfare base like it had a personal grudge. Inside the bustling galley, the air hummed with the clatter of trays, low conversations, and the scrape of boots on the floor. Trainees fresh from their morning ocean swims sat in damp uniforms, shoveling food, while their muscles screamed for rest. At table 8, a man ate quietly, minding his own business. He was 45 years old, built solid at 5 feet 10 inches and 175 pounds, dressed in tan military-style pants, a simple white t-shirt, and a pair of brown leather cowboy boots that looked completely out of place among all the regulation gear. That man was Chuck Norris. He didn't draw attention on purpose. He never did. But on this particular October day in the mid-1980s, attention found him anyway. Senior Chief Daryl Brennan, a towering 33-year-old SEAL with 12 years in the Navy and 8 as a hardened operator, spotted him from across the room. Brennan stood 6 feet 2 inches, 215 pounds of disciplined muscle, the kind built from endless PT sessions, beach runs, and real-world combat tours in Vietnam back in '72 and '73. He wore 2 bronze stars he rarely mentioned and carried the quiet confidence of a man who had taught hand-to-hand combat to generations of SEALs. Brennan had been thinking hard lately. 2 of his former students had returned from deployments, carrying that heavy silence combat leaves behind. He kept picturing one of his guys freezing up in a real fight because they'd picked up the wrong ideas from action movies. In his mind, it was his job to set the record straight. And now, here was Chuck Norris himself, the movie star famous for those spinning kicks and choreographed beatdowns, sitting right there in the galley like any other guy grabbing lunch. The senior chief made his decision. He walked straight over, stopping just behind Chuck's table. His voice carried loud and clear, meant for the 4 nearest tables to hear every word. "Sir, with respect," Brennan said, his tone steady and professional. "Movie karate is all choreography. It's not the same as actual fighting. With your permission, I'd like to demonstrate the difference to my next class of trainees." The galley didn't go completely silent right away, but conversations dropped off fast. Trainees in faded green pants and salty shirts paused mid-bite, their heads turning just enough to catch the action without getting caught staring. Forks hovered, eyes widened. This was something you didn't see every day. Chuck Norris set his fork down slowly on the tray. He didn't rush. At 45, he had a film called Invasion USA, still in post-production. He hadn't gone full speed in sparring for over a year and a half. The wise choice would have been to chuckle, brush it off, and invite the big SEAL to sit down. There was nothing to gain here. Lose. And he's the Hollywood guy who got dropped by a real operator in front of his team. Win. And he's the celebrity who put a Navy instructor on the ground. No upside. But Brennan had thrown the challenge out loud in front of 41 operators, including a couple of officers. The room had shifted. Chuck had spent enough time in tough worlds to recognize when backing down wasn't an option anymore. He looked up calmly. "Senior Chief, can I help you with something?" Brennan met his eyes without blinking. "Just one question, sir. In Missing in Action, that prison camp scene where you drop 4 guards with a spinning back kick combo in about 3 seconds, do you honestly believe that would play out the same way against 4 trained enemies in a real fight?" You could hear a pin drop now. The 8 closest tables had gone dead quiet. Wet trainees from the morning swim block stopped chewing entirely, their eyes locked on the 2 men. The tension hung thick in the air, hotter than the October sun outside. Chuck kept his voice even. "Senior Chief, that was a movie. I had 11 stuntmen, 2 takes, and a full fight choreographer on set. No, that's not how it works in a real fight." Brennan nodded, his voice still measured and carrying across the space like it did during those brutal beach runs. "Then, with respect, sir, what does happen? What I teach here is what actually works when there's no director yelling cut, no choreographer setting up the moves, and no medic waiting on the sidelines. 3 minutes, light contact, any technique you want, right here on the grinder, right now." The challenge landed heavy. Chuck didn't answer immediately. He thought it through. Brennan wasn't a bad guy. He was just rock solid certain about his world, and certainty like that can blind even the best operators. This wasn't about ego for the senior chief. It was about protecting his men from learning the wrong lessons. Still, the smart adult move was to say no. Laugh it off. Walk away. But something in the air had changed. Chuck could feel the eyes of every man in the room. He gave a small nod. "All right, Senior Chief," he said quietly. "Outside." The words rippled through the galley like a shockwave. Trainees exchanged glances. Instructors raised eyebrows. Nobody expected the movie star in cowboy boots to accept. Chuck stood up, picked up his tray, and walked it over to the dish line like it was any normal day. He stacked everything neatly. Plate on top, cup inside, silverware crossed, just so. Old habits from years of discipline. He glanced back at Brennan and gave another nod. The senior chief had already turned, his mind set on the lesson he believed these young operators needed. In his head, he was doing the right thing, showing the difference between silver screen fantasy and the ugly reality of combat, where a man is trying to kill you. His skills were battle-tested. What he didn't realize yet was that his rock-hard certainty was about to take the real hit. As the two men headed for the side doors, a small crowd began to form. 11 off-duty operators from Team 3, 8 BUD-S instructors, and 7 trainees from Class 144, still dripping from their swim, fell in behind them. Word spread fast. Captain Larry Bailey, the BUD/S commanding officer, glanced out his office window, saw the unusual procession, and stepped outside without a word. He didn't stop it. He simply watched, reading the situation in seconds. One of his top instructors had crossed a line, and now the only thing left was to see how it played out. The walk to the grinder took about 90 seconds, across the asphalt service road, past the BUD's barracks, and onto the wide concrete slab known as the grinder. 60 feet by 90 feet of flat, unforgiving surface, painted with the seal trident right in the center. Chain link fence on 3 sides. A low concrete wall on the 4th. The morning swim hoses had left it wet, and now the October sun turned it into a steaming 103-degree skillet. Chuck and Brennan stepped onto that hot concrete, the small crowd spreading out along the fence. The air felt electric. What happened next would stick with every man watching for the rest of their careers. The short walk from the galley felt longer than it should have. 90 seconds across cracked asphalt, past the low-slung BUD/S barracks where young trainees bunked between brutal sessions, and finally onto the grinder. That wide-open concrete training ground had seen countless miles of flutter kicks, push-ups, and pure suffering. Today, it would witness something different. The October sun hammered down without mercy, turning the wet surface into a shimmering 103-degree griddle. Heat waves rose off the painted seal trident in the center, making the air dance. Chuck Norris walked steady, barefoot now after slipping off those signature cowboy boots and setting them neatly against the low concrete wall. He rolled up the cuffs of his tan pants to mid-calf, keeping the plain white t-shirt on. No big show, no dramatic stripping down. He just stood there calm, letting his feet register the burning concrete. It hit hard at first, that sharp, stinging data that screams up through the soles. But he knew from years of tough training that fighting the pain only wasted energy. Give it 90 seconds and the body adjusts. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, long before Hollywood ever noticed him. Senior Chief Daryl Brennan moved with purpose. He peeled off his utility blouse and folded it with military precision, placing it on the wall beside Chuck's boots. Underneath, his brown t-shirt stretched tight over a powerful frame. 6 feet 2 inches, 215 pounds of functional muscle earned through real operations, not gym mirrors. Those cabled forearms and broad shoulders told the story of a man who did pull-ups like most people drink coffee. He'd earned his place as a hand-to-hand combat instructor the old-fashioned way. 2 tours in Vietnam, 8 solid years as a SEAL, and 2 cycles teaching BUD-S classes how to survive when everything went ugly. A crowd had gathered along the chain-link fence. 26 men in total, 11 off-duty operators from SEAL Team 3, 8 seasoned BUD-S instructors, and 7 wide-eyed trainees from Class 144, still soaked from their morning ocean swim. They stood quiet, sensing something serious was about to unfold. Captain Larry Bailey, the Bud/S commanding officer with 26 years in the Navy, had followed them out. He didn't intervene. He simply positioned himself at the fence, arms crossed, reading the tension. In his experienced eyes, Brennan had stepped into something that couldn't be undone. All that remained was to watch and learn. Brennan laid out the rules clearly, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used on the beach during those endless runs. 3 minutes, sir. Light contact only. Any technique goes. Tap out or say stop and it ends immediately. Chuck gave a single nod. Agreed. Captain Bailey stepped forward just enough to be heard. His voice cut through the thick air. Begin. The grinder fell into a rare, heavy silence. Normally this concrete echoed with trash talk, shouts, and encouragement. Not today. The only sounds were distant bass noises. A forklift rumbling cargo over at the small boats facility a few hundred yards away. The men at the fence watched like hawks, filing away every detail for later. Brennan wasted no time. He opened with a low-line front thrust kick, the kind SEALs call a teep. It wasn't meant to smash home right away. Its job was to crash the distance, close the gap fast, and turn the fight into the ugly close-quarters mess where operators excel. You don't dance around at range against someone dangerous. You get inside, smother their rhythm, and finish the job. Chuck didn't retreat. That small choice registered with every man watching. Most people back up when a big SEAL charges in. Chuck simply shifted his stance, pivoting smoothly about 8 inches off the center line. The kick sliced through empty air. Brennan was now inside Chuck's space, exactly where the senior chief wanted to be after years of drilling this approach. Second two brought a sharp elbow from Brennan, tight and short, aimed at the jaw. This was textbook SEAL close quarters stuff, taught from day one in the syllabus. Powerful, efficient, meant to end things quick. Chuck's left forearm met it, bone on bone. The impact sent a cold electric jolt down Brennan's arm, numbing his ulnar nerve from elbow to pinky finger. It wasn't the soft block most expect. This was the meeting of two conditioned weapons, and Brennan felt the difference immediately. For over 14 years, Chuck had hammered away at hardwood makiwara boards 6 days a week, hundreds of reps per arm daily. That kind of consistent training remodeled bone density through controlled stress. It created forearms that felt more like iron than flesh. Brennan powered through the sting, throwing a right cross next. It whistled past Chuck's left ear by barely 1.5 inches. Chuck had already pivoted again, smooth and economical, the same movement he'd practiced thousands of times in his Tarzana garage on the heavy bag and makiwara posts. The silence around the grinder grew deeper. 3 techniques thrown. 0 solid contact for Brennan. The operators along the fence exchanged quick glances. This wasn't what they expected from the movie star in bare feet. Frustration flickered across Brennan's face. He reset and committed hard to a double-leg takedown shoot. High-percentage SEAL combatives. At this point, staying at range and missing more would look worse in front of his own men. Better to take it to the ground where he held the edge. Chuck sprawled instantly, hips back, weight driving forward, arms underhooking Brennan's shoulders in a perfect counter. The move came from deep muscle memory, drilled for months back in 1960 at Osan Air Base under a Korean Army judo instructor named Mr. On. That old master hadn't owed Chuck anything, but he taught relentlessly until the sprawl became automatic. Brennan's shoot hit nothing but air. His chin slammed into the scorching concrete. He pushed up quickly, but Chuck didn't swarm him or press the advantage. Instead, he stepped back, creating 3 feet of neutral space, and waited. That single choice said everything. Chuck wasn't here to destroy. He was here to teach. Every man at the fence saw it. They understood in that heartbeat the kind of person who makes that decision when he clearly has the upper hand. The hot concrete continued to bake their feet. The distant forklift kept working. But on the grinder, time felt suspended. Brennan rose, shaking off the impact, his certainty starting to crack just a little. He set his right hand at his hip, telegraphing the next move through his shoulder. something Chuck had learned to read years earlier from training with Bruce Lee in a Bel Air backyard. The tension built. The crowd held its breath. What came next would rewrite how these operators thought about real fighting versus movie magic. Chuck read the shoulder commitment and exploded into action with a spinning hook kick. Not the flashy back kick from the films, but the precise horyochagi that looped around the outside of Brennan's guard, where his eyes couldn't easily track it. The instep connected cleanly with the trapezius muscle, just 2 inches from the carotid sinus. 3/4 power. Enough to stun without permanent damage. The strike overloaded Brennan's brachial plexus. The entire right side of his body went temporarily offline. He dropped to one knee on the burning concrete, eyes open, fully conscious, but unable to move that side properly. His face lost tone on the right. Breathing felt heavy because his diaphragm wasn't responding fully. The grinder stayed deathly quiet for 4 long seconds. Captain Bailey didn't step in. The 26 men at the fence didn't speak. They simply absorbed what they were seeing, a lesson unfolding in real time on that steaming slab of concrete. Chuck stood ready but patient. He waited 10 full seconds, then walked over and extended his right hand. Brennan looked at the offered hand. He looked up at Chuck's face. Then he took it. Brennan stayed on one knee for what felt like forever, though it was only moments. The right side of his body refused to cooperate. His arm hung limp, his face slack on that side, and breathing took extra effort as his diaphragm struggled to follow orders. The hot concrete burned against his knee, but the real heat came from inside. The sudden, uncomfortable awareness that everything he thought he knew about close combat had just been tested in front of his own men. Chuck Norris stood calm a few feet away, not gloating, not circling for more. He waited those 10 long seconds, giving the senior chief space to process what had happened. Then he stepped forward and offered his hand again, steady and without any show of victory. Brennan stared at it. For a man who had survived real gunfights and taught hundreds of SEALs how to win ugly, this moment hit different. He looked up into Chuck's face, searching for arrogance or pity. He found neither, just quiet respect. Brennan took the hand. Chuck pulled him up gently but firmly, then kept a light grip on his elbow to steady him as Brennan staggered half a step. The right side was still waking up slowly. Brennan could stand, but lifting that arm felt like trying to move it through thick mud. He didn't speak right away. The words wouldn't come easy. Around the chain-link fence, the 26 men remained completely still. No cheers, no jokes, no comments. Just heavy silence broken only by that distant forklift rumbling away at the small boats area. These were SEALs, men who usually filled every quiet moment with trash talk or encouragement. Today they watched like students in the middle of a master class they hadn't signed up for. Captain Larry Bailey finally left his spot at the fence and walked onto the grinder. His face showed the weight of command. He had seen enough in 26 years of Navy service to know when something important had just shifted. He picked up Brennan's folded utility blouse from the low wall and handed it over without a word. Then he turned to Chuck. "Senior Chief, get that arm working again," Bailey said. "Mr. Norris, if you don't mind, I'd like to invite you for coffee in my office in about 20 minutes. Chuck gave a small nod. Bailey turned and headed back toward the BUD/S admin building, leaving the 2 men on the concrete. The fight had lasted barely 7 seconds, but it felt much longer to everyone watching. Brennan's opening moves, the low front thrust kick, the sharp elbow, the right cross, the committed double leg shoot, had all missed or been neutralized cleanly. Chuck's responses came from decades of real training, not movie sets. The bone-on-bone forearm block, the perfect sprawl from those old judo lessons at Osan Air Base, and finally, that spinning hook kick that slipped around the guard and shut down the right side of Brennan's body. It wasn't flashy Hollywood stuff. It was precise, economical, and devastatingly effective. Brennan flexed his fingers slowly as feeling returned. The 2 men started walking back together toward the galley, the same path they had taken out, but everything felt different now. The small crowd dispersed quietly behind them. No one rushed up with questions. The operators and instructors and trainees melted away to process what they had seen in their own ways. Back inside the galley, the lunch rush had mostly cleared out. It was past 13:30 now, and the big room felt almost empty. Trays had been cleared, floors swept. Chuck's own tray from earlier was already gone, stacked neatly in the dish return like he had never been there. Brennan walked over to the line on his own and came back with 2 cups of Navy coffee, the kind that's strong, bitter, and always available no matter the hour. They sat down again at table 8, across from each other. Brennan held his cup with both hands as the feeling continued to return to his right arm. The burn from the concrete on his knee had faded to a dull reminder. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just drank the cooling coffee and let the quiet settle. Finally, Brennan broke the silence. "Sir, I'd like to ask you one honest question if that's okay." Chuck set his cup down. "Go ahead, Senior Chief." "Why didn't you press the advantage after the sprawl? You had me. You could have ended it right there on the ground." Chuck looked at him steadily. The answer came without hesitation, but not in a lecturing way. "Because you weren't my enemy out there, Senior Chief. You were a man who needed to learn something I happen to know. The only real difference between a teacher and an enemy is what you decide you are in that moment." Brennan let those words sink in deep. He took another slow sip of coffee, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. The galley around them felt miles away. In that simple space, over 2 plain cups of bad coffee, something real was being built between the movie star and the combat instructor. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of understanding that grows in quiet moments when 2 capable men recognize strength in each other. Brennan thought back to his reasons for issuing the challenge in the first place. He had watched too many young operators return from the field carrying invisible weights. He wanted to protect them from learning dangerous habits from action films. In his mind, he had been doing the responsible thing, showing the difference between choreography and reality. Now he saw that reality had more layers than he realized. Chuck's skill wasn't fake. It came from years of dedicated training. The makiwara boards that built those dense forearms. The judo sprawls drilled until they became instinct. The spinning hook kick refined far beyond any movie script. "I read your manual," Chuck added quietly, after another pause. "The one you teach from here at BUD/S. Solid stuff. But there are pieces missing from real-world experience across different traditions." Brennan nodded once, filing that away like he filed everything important. He wasn't the type to argue when proven wrong. That was part of what made him a good instructor. "That sprawl you used, it's not in our syllabus. Where exactly did you pick that up?" "Osan Air Base back in 1960, Chuck replied. "Mr. Ahn was a Korean Army judo instructor brought in to teach American servicemen. He didn't know me a thing, but he trained me hard 6 days a week for months. Made sure the movement became automatic." The conversation stayed low and respectful. No big speeches, just 2 professionals sharing space and truth. Brennan's arm had mostly come back by now. He could grip the cup normally again. The sting to his pride was fading slower, but even that was turning into something useful. The kind of correction that makes a man better if he lets it. Outside, the grinder baked empty under the sun. Inside, the 2 men finished their coffee without rushing. When Chuck finally stood up to leave, Brennan rose too. They shook hands firmly across the table. No extra words needed. The handshake said enough. Respect earned, lesson received, no hard feelings. Chuck walked out to catch his ride. Brennan stayed behind for a few minutes, sitting alone at table 8, replaying those 7 seconds in his head. He already knew this moment would shape how he taught from now on. Not because he lost, but because he learned. Captain Bailey would want to talk soon. The young trainees and operators who watched from the fence would carry pieces of this story forward in their own careers. But right then, in the quiet galley, the real impact was still settling in. One man's certainty had met real-world skill, and both walked away, changed. The days after the grinder changed things in ways no one saw coming. Senior Chief Daryl Brennan went back to his regular routine, but something inside him had shifted. That short, 7-second clash on the hot concrete stayed with him like a fresh scar that didn't hurt so much as it taught. His right arm came back fully within the hour, but the real recovery happened slower, in his mind. He spent the next few weeks turning the experience over and over, not with anger, but with the steady focus of a man who wanted to make his teaching better. 3 weeks later, Brennan sat down at his desk and wrote a one-page formal recommendation. He kept it professional and to the point. He suggested adding specific Tang Soo Do principles to the BUD/S close quarters combat curriculum. Things like better sprawl counters and ways to handle stalled fights up close. He described the spinning hook kick, the Horyo Chagi, as a strong finishing option when someone gets inside your guard and things turn messy. He didn't name Chuck Norris in the document. He didn't need to. The lesson stood on its own. Captain Larry Bailey reviewed it personally. He signed off without hesitation and sent it up the chain. Rear Admiral Irvy Charles Lemoyne, commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 1, added his endorsement. By February 1986, the changes were approved. From BUD/S Class 145 all the way through 211, new trainees started learning these extra tools. Operators who later joined the Special Mission Units in the late 1980s carried those sprawl counters and hook kick ideas into real deployments. Most of them never knew the story behind the syllabus page. They just knew the techniques worked when it counted. Brennan finished his time as a hand-to-hand instructor and rotated out of BUD/S in December 1985, just 2 months after that October afternoon. He kept serving, eventually retiring as a Master Chief in 1998. He stayed quiet about the grinder for years. The story wasn't something he bragged about or used to entertain friends. It was personal. He only told it once, in 2003, on a quiet evening to his own son the night before the young man shipped out for BUD/S Class 247. He sat across from him at the kitchen table, much like Table 8 in the Galley, and shared the truth without any extra drama. "Listen close," he said. "This is how you stay humble and keep learning, no matter how good you think you are." Captain Bailey carried the memory too. He retired in 1991 and years later in 2008 mentioned the incident in a single paragraph during an oral history interview with the Naval Institute Press. The interviewer tried to dig deeper, but Bailey politely declined. That short paragraph still sits in the archive today. 218 words, marked for restricted release. It captures just enough to show something important happened on the grinder that day, but not enough to spill all the details. The 26 men who lined the chain link fence carried the story forward in their own way. Over the next 18 months, as they spread out to Coronado, Norfolk, Subic Bay, Little Creek, and other duty stations, each one told it exactly once. They picked the most junior guy in their next platoon and shared it during the quiet hour after a hard PT session. No big audience, just one young operator hearing it from someone he respected. The story grew a little each time, the way good sea stories do. In one version, Chuck broke Brennan's collarbone. In another, the fight stretched out to 30 seconds of non-stop action. Someone even claimed Bailey tried to stop it, and Chuck kept going anyway. None of that happened. But the core stayed true. A movie star in cowboy boots showed up, answered a challenge with real skill, and taught a hardened instructor something valuable without making it personal. The accurate version lived on in the Naval Special Warfare Command Archive. Declassified in 2019, the training improvement recommendation sits there for anyone who knows to ask for the right file. It's also woven into SEAL Team 3's oral history, sometimes called the day the Air Force took the grinder. That nickname started as a joke among the teams, but it stuck because it captured the surprise of it all. Chuck Norris flew home the next morning on a regular commercial flight, sitting in coach seat 14C. He never brought it up in his 2004 memoir, Against All Odds. He didn't mention it on talk shows or during any of the hundreds of USO visits he made over the next 40 years. Late in his life, one of his longtime students asked him why he stayed silent about it. Chuck gave a simple answer. Daryl Brennan was a great instructor. A great instructor's correction isn't anyone else's story to tell. That response says everything about the kind of man he was. He didn't need the spotlight or the glory. He showed up in a rental car, took off his boots, answered the question with action instead of words, drank the bad coffee, shook hands, and went home. No press releases, no victory laps, just quiet respect. Back on base, life moved on, but the grinder felt different for a while. Trainees ran their evolutions on the same hot concrete, but the older instructors carried a new edge in their teaching. They push the idea that real skill comes from humble, consistent training over years, not from looking flashy. Brennan's certainty had been corrected, and he turned that into something positive for every class that followed. Years later, when those young trainees from Class 144 became seasoned operators themselves, they would sometimes share pieces of the story with their own teams, not to tear anyone down, but to remind them that even the best can learn something new on any given day. The lesson wasn't about Chuck beating Brennan. It was about how both men handled themselves afterward, with dignity, honesty, and a willingness to grow. That October afternoon left a mark that lasted decades. It showed that true strength isn't just about winning on the concrete. It's about what you do when the fight ends and the real conversation begins. Brennan and Chuck built something durable in that quiet galley over 2 cups of coffee, a bridge of respect between different worlds, Hollywood and the teams, movie training and combat reality. And that bridge still stands in the way the curriculum evolved, and in the quiet stories passed from one generation of operators to the next. The sun kept beating down on the grinder, the ocean still rolled in for those cold swims, and Bud/S kept producing some of the toughest men on the planet. But every so often, an instructor would demonstrate a sprawl counter or a well-placed hook kick, and the older guys would exchange a knowing look. They remembered, they carried it forward, and they made sure the next generation understood that fighting isn't about choreography. It's about preparation, adaptability, and having the character to learn when someone shows you a better way. That single afternoon on the BUD/S grinder left ripples that traveled far beyond the concrete slab and the chain-link fence. What started as a challenge in a noisy galley turned into one of those rare moments that quietly reshape how professionals think about their craft. For the men who witnessed it, and for those who heard the story later, it became more than just a tale of a movie star and a SEAL instructor. It became a reminder that real expertise runs deeper than appearances, and that true strength includes knowing when to teach instead of destroy. Senior Chief Daryl Brennan carried the memory for the rest of his career and well into retirement. He never sought attention for it. In fact, he rarely spoke of it at all. The lesson he learned that day about certainty, humility, and the difference between movie magic and battlefield reality became part of how he approached every class he taught afterward. He rotated out of the instructor role shortly after, but the changes he recommended stayed behind, baked into the curriculum for years to come. Young SEALs learning sprawl counters and those precise spinning hook kicks had no idea the techniques traced back to a barefoot man in cowboy boots on a hot October day. They just knew the moves gave them an edge when things got chaotic in real operations. Brennan retired as a Master Chief in 1998 after a long and respected career. Even then, he kept the full story close. It wasn't until 2003, the night before his son headed off to Bud/S Class 247, that he finally shared the details. They sat together in the kitchen, 2 generations of quiet warriors, and Brennan told it straight. No exaggerations, no hero talk. He wanted his son to understand that even the best instructors get corrected sometimes, and that the mark of a good operator is how you respond when it happens. That conversation became a passing of wisdom, father to son, the kind that strengthens the line of men who volunteer for the hardest jobs. Captain Larry Bailey retired in 1991. He lived with the memory, too, mentioning it only briefly in that 2008 oral history interview. Just 218 carefully chosen words in the Naval Institute archives. When the interviewer pushed for more, Bailey shut it down politely. Some experiences, he seemed to believe, lose their power when over-explained. They belong to the men who were there, breathing the hot air and feeling the silence settle over the grinder. The 26 witnesses spread the story in their own quiet way. As they moved to new teams and new bases, Coronado, Norfolk, overseas postings, each picked one junior operator and shared it during those still hours after tough training. The details shifted a bit over time, as stories do among warriors. Some versions added broken bones or longer fights, but the heart stayed the same. A humble man in a white t-shirt showed up, answered a direct challenge with skill and character, and walked away without needing to prove anything extra. Those retellings helped shape the culture. They reminded young SEALs that ego has no place when lives are on the line, and that learning never really stops, no matter how decorated you become. The official record eventually saw daylight. In 2019, the Naval Special Warfare Command declassified the training improvement recommendation Brennan had written. Anyone who knows how to ask can pull the file today. It sits alongside SEAL Team 3's oral histories, sometimes referred to with a grin as the day the Air Force took the grinder. That nickname started as lighthearted ribbing but grew into something respectful. It captured the surprise of an outsider stepping onto their turf and leaving a positive mark. Chuck Norris himself never chased credit. He flew home the next morning in a regular coach seat, 14C, and slipped back into his life. No interviews, no chapters in his memoir, no mentions during hundreds of USO trips or public appearances. When a longtime student asked him about it late in life, Chuck gave a straightforward reply that perfectly matched the man he was. Daryl Brennan was a fine instructor doing his job. His correction wasn't a story for outsiders to retell for fame. It was between the two of them. That attitude defined Chuck. He had built his skills the long, hard way. Years of garage training, makiwara boards, judo lessons from a Korean master who owed him nothing, and constant refinement that went far beyond any film choreography. He showed up that day not looking for a fight, but willing to answer a serious question with honest action. He took off his boots, felt the burning concrete, used what he knew, and then sat down for bad coffee afterward. No victory dance, just respect and a handshake. The legacy lives on in small but meaningful ways. Bud/S classes continued to grind through their training on that same concrete. Instructors added layers to the hand-to-hand program that made operators more adaptable. The story encouraged a culture of continuous learning, that even proven techniques can be improved by ideas from other traditions. It showed that fighting isn't only about power and speed. It's about timing, reading your opponent, staying calm under pressure, and choosing wisdom over winning at all costs. For the SEAL community, it reinforced something they already lived by, but sometimes needed reminding. The best warriors stay humble. They study, they adapt, and they pass on what works without turning it into personal legend. Brennan's certainty got corrected, but he turned that into better training for everyone who followed. Chuck demonstrated that real masters don't need applause. They just do what's right and move on. Decades later, when new recruits hear fragments of the tale during late-night talks in the barracks, it still lands with weight. They picture the steaming grinder, the silent crowd, the barefoot man in the white t-shirt, and the big instructor dropping to one knee. They feel the lesson. Question what you think you know, especially when it comes from screens and scripts. Real combat demands preparation that runs bone deep, built over years of quiet, consistent work. The ocean still crashes cold against the beaches near Coronado. The sun still bakes the grinder until it shimmers. Trainees still suffer through swims, runs, and endless drills that break most men. But somewhere in the lineage of those who make it through, there's a thread from that October day, a reminder that legends aren't always loud. Sometimes they wear cowboy boots, drink bitter coffee, and teach with one well-placed technique and a steady hand up afterward. Chuck Norris proved that day that his skills weren't just for cameras. Brennan proved he was big enough to learn in public. Together, without planning it, they gave the team something lasting, a story of respect across different worlds, and a push toward better, more complete training. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't fade. It echoes in every operator who steps onto the grinder, ready to learn, adapt, and serve with quiet excellence. And in the end, that might be the most powerful victory of all.